Welcome to this session of Peace Week. I'm Daniel Rothbard, professor at the Carter School, and it's wonderful that you can join us for this event. As you know, the primary theme of Peace Week is Horizons of Innovation and Entrepreneurship for Peace, which basically invites presentations on innovative methods for analysis of protracted violent conflicts and, of course, for mitigation or ideally resolution of those conflicts towards peace. And I looked at the schedule for the week and really fantastic sessions that you have an opportunity, obviously they started this morning, you have an opportunity to present. So today we are focusing on a particular extremely violent conflict in Sudan, and we are going to highlight a methodology, a perspective for investigating human rights violations of war crimes. And so that's our primary focus will be on the human rights violations and how to investigate those violations. What's at stake here, of course, with such investigations is potential prosecution of perpetrators. So today, and I'm going to, well, you probably saw the schedule. So I'll start off just explaining the background of the conflict, and then we'll turn to David Marshall. He is Principal Intelligence and Policy Strategist, Group Leader in the Special Operations Department of MITRE. The importance, the centrality of his work comes from the collaboration that George Mason has had for about a year now, or officially since February 1st this year, a collaboration with MITRE, which is a contractor, I think it's non-for-profit officially contractor, David, of large government projects. And so George Mason is collaborating deeply with MITRE for this investigation. So after David Marshall, we will turn to Dr. Matteo Berri, who is a conflict monitoring and analysis specialist. And he is going to present some of the data, some of the findings that we have gathered from our investigation of the devastation in Sudan. And then we will turn to Dieter Foser, Dr. Dieter Foser, who is chair of the department. Oh, I should say, by the way, that Matteo is an alum of the Carter School, graduated December of 2022. Dieter Foser is chair of the Department of Geography and Geoinformation Science at George Mason University. He is also director of the Center for Geospatial Intelligence, and he will showcase some of the satellite imagery that have been gathered for the report. And I should say, the four of us basically are in this room, but our team includes I think it's 16 people. The GMU team basically includes 16 people, including a group of Sudanese who are working for an organization called the Sudan Human Rights Hub. So we're going to be summarizing this. So I will start things off, and as always, I ask that you mute your audio and feel free to raise questions in the chat. We will have time after the presentations for discussion questions and your observations. So I will start off basically with something that you probably already know, that Sudan is currently experiencing a horrific war with levels of devastation that certainly are comparable to the catastrophe in Gaza and Israel, as well as Ukraine. This is one of 59 protracted violent conflicts that are currently raging in the world. And I'm going to share my screen. Just a kind of big picture here. This is a war, of course, as usual, between groups of machines and men. I mean, there are men, there's no women fighting in this, but it's also a war of massive civilian devastation. And I'm giving you kind of a summation of the scale of devastation that the Sudanese have experienced. 1,400 violent events occurring between the beginning of the war, which was April 15th last year, the war is still going on, but on this research, between April and April, there are 1,400 violent events occurring in which civilians have been targeted. Between April 15th and May 14th, more than 16,000 fatalities have occurred. 7.9 Sudanese internally displaced up to August 7th, which, by the way, makes Sudan the country with the largest number of internally displaced persons in the world. More than 2.1 newly arrived refugees, 24.8 million people needing humanitarian assistance. And one example of the humanitarian assistance, or one dimension of it, is the devastation to the healthcare system in the country, which have been strategically targeted. So the question I'm going to raise in the few minutes that I have is, how does this occur? Why, and what is the pattern of this violence? So very important for this conflict is to understand the recent history of the conflict. That Sudan, since its independence in 1956, Sudan has been at war with itself in so many occasions. And I'm just highlighting here a few of the many wars that have been waged. You see here those years, 1963 to 72, the first Civil War, 2002 to 2005, the war in Darfur. Darfur is the western region of Sudan, in which the Sudanese armed forces clashed with rebels who were seeking to protect three ethnic groups. In other words, the Sudanese armed forces were devastating the ethnic groups called the Fur, the Masalit, and the Zagawa. And this has been recognized, this devastation came to the level, was recognized as genocidal violence by the International Criminal Court. Now, importantly, the Sudanese armed forces conjoined their attack with a group called the Janjaweed. The Janjaweed basically are not exactly a distinct ethnic group, but they emerged from the Arab groups in and near the Darfur region of Sudan. They're comprised of former soldiers, criminals, and unemployed men. So then a war that was occurring at the same time as the Darfur War was the Second Civil War in 1983 to 2005. And then there were a number of wars in 2013. All of these wars included a deep sense of struggle over the soul of the nation. That is, a major challenge here was to explore and to identify and to vilify groups that were considered not authentic Sudanese. This was perpetuated by the central government. The central government basically perpetuated what, in effect, is a racist policy against certain ethnic groups, in particular the Fur, Masalit, and Zagawa during the Darfur attacks. And this was one of the factors that perpetuated the war. In the President Omar al-Bashir came into office in 1989, and he was responsible basically for overseeing the war, the Second Civil War, and of course the war in Darfur. This is a picture of the Janjaweed fighters. So very importantly for our project, who are the Janjaweed fighters? Well, basically, as I said, they are a group who came from Arab, various Arab tribes, and during their attacks, they were yelling racist slur, and I just have a couple of them here to cleanse Darfur of the dirty slaves. You are slaves, Zagawa slaves. We will kill all blacks. And of course, the animalistic images and so on. There was the classic slurs and dehumanizing imagery of genocidal violence. And so this is very significant for the current war because it shows that the government was routinely relying on militia forces, in part because they did not trust their own civilian, their own military forces. And these are just examples of the conversion of the Janjaweed to the rapid support forces. So what is absolutely critical for understanding the violence in Sudan today is that the current perpetrator of much of the violence, which is called the rapid support forces, emerged in kind of as a result of the president, the commander-in-chief seeking militia force and support from that group. In other words, they emerged as a result of the remnants of the Janjaweed. In 2013, the rapid support forces were created under the control of President Omar al-Bashir. He recruited heavily from Arab communities in Darfur, and they were drawn by hatred of so-called non-Arab groups. They were motivated by enhanced social status and material reward. They were given money, cars, and military rank. But the central government trained the RSF. And then the RSF basically attacked these regions in Sudan that are listed. But in 2016, and leading up to that, the RSF then changed their allegiance and started fighting with SAF. In other words, the rapid support forces then began, even though they were created by the central government, they began to have military clashes over material control of various resources. Moving forward to 2019, Omar al-Bashir was overthrown, was ousted in a military coup, and basically elevating General al-Burhan to take control of the central government. General Burhan basically commissioned the support of Mohammed Hamdad Hamedi Dagalo. He is in charge now of the rapid support forces, a very, I think, respectable looking military leader, but oversees the massive civilian devastation that has been wrought at least since the April 15th of 2023. Fast forward, Omar al-Bashir was overthrown, as I said, so that this slide is a little out of sequence. I should have put it a little earlier. He was overthrown as a result of a mass movement, civil and peaceful movements, at least by the protesters, that led to his overthrow. Okay, So today, the civil war is raging between the Sudan Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces. And the as I say, by 2019, the Rapid Support Forces engaged in pitched battle against the Sudanese armed forces, and that these are the primary antagonists of the conflict. And I just list here a couple of the battles that have that have that have been waged in this war. So as I say, this is a war in which civilians are targeted on a massive scale. And what we have examined and kind of through our investigation is that there's at least three kinds of civilian targeting. The first is indiscriminate assaults in public places. And this is where the Rapid Support Forces basically will somewhat arbitrarily attack civilians. Many of the attacks are targeted against ethnic groups, in particular the group called the Masalit, but other attacks seem totally arbitrary. Second kind of attack, as I mentioned before, is attack on the healthcare system. These are attacks basically from the air. Some hospitals are bombed. There's an attack, rocket fire from the ground. And then the soldiers, the Rapid Support Forces in particular, would enter the hospital, engage in massive looting, and even taking equipment away from patients who are undergoing critical care. They also will plunder and brutalize some of the medical staff and the civilians, the patients. A third form of targeting is gender-based violence, which is massive. It's normalized, and it's quite clear that the Rapid Support Forces seem that they are entitled to do this. Now, even though I've been mentioning Rapid Support Forces, it's very important to recognize that the Sudan Armed Forces as well has committed human rights violations. There has been reports of gender-based violence. There has been very clear evidence that Sudanese armed forces have attacked hospitals and some indiscriminate assaults. But clearly, the scale of the civilian targeting is so imbalanced. It's much more committed by Rapid Support Forces. So in a nutshell, this war is a war of plunder, greed, and power. It's a war of kleptocracy, which basically means that the forces represent, in effect, as Alex DeWall so correctly points out, he writes that Sudan is run by a cabal of merchants and generals who plunder the darker-skinned people of the marshlands and bring their wealth to Khartoum, a relatively opulent and a haven for calm. But the logic of kleptocracy is inexorable. When the cartel is bankrupt, the mobsters shoot it out. It should be shooted out. And that's what is going on here in Sudan, as I say, leading to massive civilian devastation. So I'm going to now turn it over to David Marshall to talk about our project with MITRE. Thank you.
Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Dan, first off, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to be here today and to talk about this very important work that we're doing. So I'm Dave Marshall. I'm an intelligence and policy strategist with the MITRE Corporation, and I serve as one of the project leads for the Conflict Observatory. I'm also a real-life graduate of the Carter School and fondly remember my time there. But before we dive in and talk about the Conflict Observatory, wanted to take a brief diversion for the sake of context and talk about what this thing is that's called MITRE. Apologies in advance for some corporate wonkiness, but I think this is important to tell the story of how we got to where we are right now. And in line with the theme of Peace Week, I want to highlight some of the advanced technological capabilities that MITRE brings to bear. So I have a few slides that I can share.
Right, we see it. Thank you.
Okay, good. So MITRE was founded in 1958 in Bedford, Massachusetts, and consists of roughly 9,000 employees spread across the US and the globe to some extent. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization that operates in the public interest and tackles some of the nation's hardest problems to try to make the world a safer place. So doing this comes with a commitment to fostering and sparking innovative ideas and collaboration, which means we take a systems engineering approach, taking our learnings from one area or experience and apply them in new ways. Through our public-private partnerships and federally funded research and development centers, MITRE works across government and in partnership with industry to tackle challenges to the safety, stability, and well-being of our nation. We solve tough problems that industry can't or won't work on because there isn't a profit motive or a realistic way to get consensus on a solution. We don't operate with commercial interest. Again, we work in the public interest. So at MITRE, we see things a bit differently, using the proprietary and privileged data that we're entrusted with to tackle issues that span multiple entities, taking lessons learned from one domain and putting them to work in another. Working across all of government, we have a unique vantage point with a culture that's open to freely adapted, proven strategies in one area to challenges in another. Additionally, we often need to completely transform systems for the public good. For instance, MITRE is architecting a national airspace system, designing a future where rockets, satellites, airplanes, and drones can safely operate with cooperation and agreement across government and industry, and reducing barriers to private investment in space. So many companies work on big problems, obviously, but at MITRE, we use our core differentiators to deliver new ways of thinking. This includes battling COVID, improving cancer treatment, protecting our economic and national security, and discovering ways to keep surface to space passage safe and viable. So I'm going to talk about FFRDCs for a minute here. Federally funded research and development centers are special organizations that promote objective collaboration to solve large-scale problems in ways that affect us all every day. These unique organizations serve as long-term strategic partners to government, providing objective guidance in an environment free of conflicts of interest. Today, MITRE operates 6 FFRDCs, more than any other entity, working across government and in partnership with industry to tackle challenges to the safety, stability, and well-being of our nation. So I'll dive into each one very briefly, and then we'll talk more about the Conflict Observatory. For nearly 60 years, MITRE and the FAA have been advancing the safety, security, effectiveness, and efficiency of aerospace in the United States and around the world by conducting a continuing program of research, development, and engineering in collaboration with the aviation community. The Center for Advanced Aviation System Development is shaping tomorrow's transportation enterprise and our nation's next generation air traffic control. We envision a future where aviation and commercial space coexist, both safely and efficiently. From taxpayers to veterans to the administrative courts, MITRE is advancing technology to enhance enterprise systems, meet mission needs, and improve the customer experience. The Center for Enterprise Modernization works with federal agencies so their critical systems can better serve citizens and the public. These R&D programs include acquisition reform, data protection, fraud detection, AI, and advanced modeling and analytics. The Health FFRDC is an objective advisor to HHS and other agencies with similar missions. And with the Health FFRDC, we're focused on transforming data into insights for better health outcomes. This includes interoperability, clinical informatics, cybersecurity, and health systems prototyping, among other areas in health and human services. The Health FFRDC accelerates health and human services innovation by connecting people and data to reinvent health systems, enhancing the care experience and protecting and promoting the health and well-being of all Americans. Few areas illustrate complexity like the modern homeland security environment. The Homeland Security Systems Engineering and Development Institute brings systems thinking to these intersecting challenges, ranging from countering terrorist threats and protecting our borders to securing our infrastructure while enabling travel and trade. HSETI helps to elevate the impact we have on our sponsors' missions and protect the freedoms our Constitution guarantees. The National Cybersecurity FFRDC helps businesses secure their critical data and infrastructure by fostering public-private collaborations to identify and solve real-world cybersecurity threats, increasing the adoption rate of more secure technologies and accelerating innovation. And then finally, the National Security Engineering Center is improving situational awareness and making sure communication systems stand up to cyber attacks. We're integrating legacy systems with new ones and even designing a framework for fielding and protecting assets in space. So, stop sharing. The State Department does not yet have its own FFRDC, but it does have an existing relationship with MITRE. And in this FFRDC-like role as partner and trusted advisor, MITRE operates the Conflict Observatory on behalf of State Department's Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations. The mission of the Conflict Observatory is to document, track, and hold those accountable for atrocities and war crimes committed in Sudan and Ukraine, using commercially available remote sensing data or satellite imagery for the most part, and fusing that with publicly available information such as social media content and reports. We took over operations of the Conflict Observatory in October of last year from its previous performer, and our current period of performance ends at the end of this calendar year. So in this role as the operator of the Conflict Observatory, MITRE manages things from a technical perspective when it comes to the analytic environment, data preservation tools, and remote sensing data, or acquiring remote sensing data from satellite assets. But we've also brought in researchers such as George Mason University's Carter School and the Geospatial Intelligence Center to do the work in this collaborative environment. So with that, I guess I apologize if I'm having some audio issues, but I'm going to hand it over to Matt to talk a little bit more about the work being done.
Okay, thanks very much, David. Matt, Barry.
Thank you. Can you see my screen?
Not yet. Well, I see your audio.
Okay.
I see your face, but now, yes, we see it. Thank you.
So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Dave, for presenting MITRE. I've just learned much from MITRE. Dave has already said certain things about our work at the Sudan Conflict Observatory. And I'm going to highlight some of these things through an analysis of data that we've collected in the framework of this project. The Sudan Conflict Observatory team at Mason has been helping to monitor the evolution of the violence in Sudan and document incidents of violence, especially against civilians and human rights abuses. And this since February 2024. And we have collected a large amount of data that helps identify the trends and patterns of the violence and answer a few questions that you may have. For example, how has the conflict evolved along the map in 2024? You may need to know that. Or what has been the nature of the type of violence recorded? Which areas or type of objects or people have been most affected? Where has been the violence more prevalent? Which areas, which regions have been most affected? What has been the impact of a war, for example, on the economy or on civilians? And if on civilians, which kind of civilians and where? And what can we expect in the month ahead or even in the years to come? So we do some retrospective analysis, but also we try to anticipate what may happen. And to do that work, we have relied on online open sources that are accessible to everyone, but you need to have some data mining techniques, and you need to be able to scroll the web and get relevant data to answer this type of questions. But since we started collecting data only in February of this year, if you want to have a broader view of the trends and patterns that we are going to mention here, you might need to go back to the beginning of the war, that is April 15. And this is what I did. I tried to retrieve relevant data from ACLED, the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Set, but I excluded riots and protests. So I had to manipulate the data a bit and focus only on data of interest. For example, battles, strategic developments, and exclude riots and protests. And after retrieving the data, I proceeded to analyze them, and I use a statistical analysis software, an open source statistical analysis software called Jamovi, to analyze the data and try to identify the trends and patterns of violence. And then I visualize the data by using a software that you all have access to. It's Excel, to make things easier. This graph that you see here is a graph that highlights the main types of violent incidents that have been recorded in Sudan, at least from February to the end of August, of last August. And it shows you here on the left the main types of violence that we have witnessed there. And we can see that most of the violence has been directed against civilians, up to 102 incidents that we recorded in this lapse of time from February to the end of August. And it has been, this shows clearly that the warring parties have not limited themselves to military operations such as battles and shelling, but they were also involved in a deliberate targeting of non-combatant civilians and a destruction of critical infrastructure, as well as gender-based violence. You can see here, there have been at least 16 of them, and other forms of violence that damage or destroyed non-military targets. For example, critical infrastructure, telecommunication, infrastructure, bridges, and even museums and other cultural heritage sites, just to cite a few cases. Now, we identified at least 75 cases of indiscriminate use of weapons, which shows that the belligerents care little about protecting human lives, even though the RSF claim that they have been paying attention to distinguishing civilians and non-civilian targets. And in fact, the RFS commander, General Dagalo, posted a statement on the RSF X Plus platform, reminding his fighters that they have to abide by the rules of engagement of the militia and to comply with international humanitarian norms. But so far, it has not been the case up to this day, and we continue to record incidents where civilians or civilian neighborhoods and objects are targeted. Based on the data that we have in the incident log of the Sudan Conflict Observatory, we observe that there have been, from February to August, at least 156 incidents reported by the media, including social media online, and at least 3,854 people were killed. And those data are data that you can access online, and that gives you an idea of the numeric evolution of the incidents and fatalities. In fact, the death toll is much higher. And there are cases where the number of people injured or killed is not accurate, cannot be determined, and we didn't count that because we don't want to be guessing. But the graph shows you the number of incidents, how the number of incidents here has evolved along the month. And this is just data from open sources. We don't include other sources as accurate data. And a statistical analysis of the data also gives you an idea of the perpetrators, who are the people behind the violence. And the most frequent perpetrator, as you can see here from this graph, has been the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, either alone or assisted by allied Arab militias, especially in Darfur, in the 4 Darfur states. And but the Sudanese armed forces, either alone or in fighting the RSF, has also perpetrated much violence against civilians and human rights abuses. And this finding, in fact, is corroborated by accurate data and by the conclusion of the UN fact-finding mission report. And in fact, without any need to go to the field, we were able from here, using open source investigation techniques, to identify who is behind the violence and who is doing what in the field. Now here, when you try to understand where the violence is happening and sketch a bit the geography of the conflict, you can see from an analysis of the data, just a basic descriptive statistical analysis of the data, you can see that, in fact, the Darfur states have been the most affected, especially North Darfur, where El Fasher is located. El Fasher is the capital of the capital city of the North Darfur state. This is where the Darfur governor is, and the Rapid Support Forces, who have been controlling the other states of Darfur, have been fighting hard to get control of El Fasher. And the if they manage to do so, they would be controlling the whole Darfur region. And the battles there have been fierce and oppose them not only to the Sudan armed forces, but the armed movement of joint forces. And you can see here which regions have been most affected. Besides the Darfur region, you have Khartoum that has recorded at least 69 incidents in the period we considered, from February to August 2024. And we just focus on data available from open sources. But this is a sample that gives you an idea of the overall trends, at least at the geographical level. Statistical analysis also gives us not only an idea of the geographical distribution of the incidents and the perpetrators, but also which states have been most affected, as I said. You have Khartoum, Al Jazeera, Senaa, and the Kordofan state, North and West Kordofan. And you can see from here that some states have been relatively quite safe. Now, which areas have been targeted or affected by the belligerents' attacks within these states? Which type of places, public spaces, or areas have been most affected? So we drill down the analysis to get some detail and answer this question. And we realize that first, the belligerents have not spared any type of space. They have attacked and targeted both cities and villages and towns. They have not spared any civilian target, including healthcare centers, schools, humanitarian convoys, refugee camps like the Zamzam camp, residential neighborhoods, even markets, religious sites like mosques, and utility centers, for example, water distribution system or telecommunication infrastructure. So it has been a total warfare that has cared little to make a distinction between civilians and military. And in fact, these trends are corroborated by some data from ACLED. And here I share with you just a few stats about the war from April 15, that is the beginning of the war, up to August 30th. And this is based on ACLED data, excluding riots and protests. And you can see clearly here that civilians have been targeted thousands of times, at least 2,254 times. And at least 5,726 civilians have been killed just in this period that we considered. So this, of course, does not include military fatalities. And this is a minimal estimate. And we can go deeper in the analysis and tell you in what type of incident or events people were killed and which type of incident were the most lethal, especially in battles. In battles, there are thousands of people who have been killed, and also in explosions and remote violence, but mostly in battles. And when we consider the evolution of the number of incidents and fatalities from one year to another, we realize that the first year has been much more lethal than the second one. In 2023, you have had at least 5,304 incidents that resulted in the death of more than 15,000 people. And by the end of August, we had recorded 4,100 plus incidents. And the number of fatalities was half of what was recorded last year. Now, let's talk a bit about the impacts of the war. I'll go a bit fast here because you know it from the news media, but what you may lack are some numbers to know the scale of the impact. What we know from our data is that you have a large majority of incidents that have resulted in human rights violation. And most of the incidents, as I said, targeted civilians. And this has caused not only much suffering among the civilian population, but for example, anger, insecurity, and forced displacement of thousands of millions of people. It has also damaged critical infrastructure on which people relied for their living. It has impacted the agricultural production. And you have numbers here that show the scale of the impact. We know also something about the economic impact. We couldn't give a very precise assessment of the economic impact, but the IMF at the beginning of this year, more precisely in February 2024, had predicted a 18% contraction of the Sudanese economy in 2024. And this was up from 12% economic decline in 2023. And the World Bank attributed this sharp economic decline to the disruption of the economic production and the decimation of the human capital, and also, of course, the infrastructure. And just on September 19th of this year, the Central Bureau of Statistics of Sudan released a report about the worsening inflation and economic crisis. And Sudan's annual inflation is estimated to be 215% in total. But there is a difference between rural and urban areas. Rural areas that are the most impoverished, generally in Africa, are the most affected also by war. The inflation rate in rural areas has been estimated to be 237%, while in urban areas it is only 189. Now, just a few numbers here to give you an idea of the scale of the impact on civilians. By September 15, it was estimated that there were 10.5 million people in Sudan who were displaced. And 8 million were internally displaced within the country. And more than 2 million went to neighboring countries, especially Chad, South Sudan, Uganda, Ethiopia, Egypt, and so on. The healthcare system has been really struggling hard to respond to the emergency needs because more than 80% of the healthcare facilities were destroyed or partially damaged or forced to close. And many of them have experienced shortages of medicine and supplies. And of course, this has facilitated the spread of diseases such as cholera, watery diarrhea, and so on. And to make matters worse, Sudan, like other Sahel countries, have experienced heavy rains that have caused floods. And these floods have affected more than 70,000 families, destroyed thousands of homes. And we know at least that 220 people were killed. We can link these floods to climate change, and some analysts also estimate that all the violent conflict across the Sahel are caused directly or indirectly by the effects of climate change. I've talked already about hunger and malnutrition. It have worsened in Sudan, that was already experiences food insecurity before the war, because now, according to a latest report of the World Food Programme, it is estimated that 24% of the population in Sudan suffer from acute hunger. And the humanitarian aid deployed has not been up to the needs that have been assessed. Now, what can we expect in the coming month? As you know, it's difficult to predict the future, but what we can say, based on the data that we have, is that the war is likely to escalate for simple reasons. There are at least 3 indicators that show it. First, the leaders of the Sudanese armed forces have been acquiring new arms. In early September, for example, the Sudanese government, through the defense industry system, this is a company that is linked to the Sudanese government, has signed a cooperation agreement with a Chinese company called CPMIEC. And the main objective of that agreement, I quote, is to strengthen and sustain Sudan's defense and security readiness. And yet, there is an arms embargo, and this company, the defense industry system, has been sanctioned by the US Department of Treasury. The second indicator is that the leaders of the Sudanese army have little political will in participating in recent peace initiative or implementing peace deals. And they have shown little willingness to negotiate any ceasefire. For example, on September 10th, the assistant commander-in-chief of the Sudanese army declared, I quote him, "New sophisticated weapons have entered the battle. They will make a big difference and will help us destroy the militia soon." He is referring here to the RSF. So if the Sudanese armed forces want military victory at all costs, we can imagine that the conflict is more than likely to escalate, to be prolonged, and cause more destruction and more losses of human lives. And of course, there will be more likely more civilian fatalities, because both the Sudanese army and the RSF use indiscriminate tactics, especially shelling, and they target civilians who are suspected of collaborating with their adversary. We can also expect sometime this year or next year a deployment of a UN peacekeeping force, especially if the UN Security Council follows the recommendation of the fact-finding mission. The fact-finding mission submitted a report on September 16, and they made the following conclusion, I quote, "Sudan's warring parties have committed an appalling range of harrowing human rights violations and international crimes, including many which may account as war crimes and crimes against humanity." And for that reason, the fact-finding mission recommended an independent and impartial force with a mandate to safeguard civilians, and that force should be deployed without delay. So we are likely to see in the coming month not only deployment of a UN peacekeeping force, but also an extension of the UN arms embargo. It was just limited to Darfur, but it is likely to be extended to the whole country because the parties haven't shown any willingness really to cooperate and enforce that arms embargo. But I'm not sure personally that they will make an effort also to respect this new embargo. There are at least 16 entities and individuals in Sudan that are under US sanctions. In the list, you find military commanders, Sudanese companies. But despite these sanctions and despite the UN arms embargo, the Sudanese armed forces continue, as you know, to acquire new arms. We may also expect, if not this year, at least in the years to come, that the leaders of the RSF and the Sudanese army might be held accountable for war crimes and human rights abuses, but the ICC is better positioned to answer this question. To finish, I would say that the best hope that we can have on Sudan is that the warring parties accept to negotiate a ceasefire, that they respect the ceasefire, and prepare the country to return to the constitutional order through elections, but provided that none of them participate in these elections as candidates. So I stop here and I leave the floor to Professor Dieter. He is the head of our GIS team to show you through satellite imagery the destruction that have been caused by the attacks. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Matt. And let me just say, before we turn it to Dieter, I think it's clear that the data that Matt just showed reflects an enormous scale of data mining among many, many different kinds of sources. And now we'll turn to the methodology of satellite imagery and Dieter Fosser.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. Thanks to the three speakers already about talking about our effort on the Sudan Conflict Observatory. Just briefly about what we are doing, sort of what our research is. So I'm a professor on the Fairfax campus. It was mentioned before, and also right now the chair of the Geography and Geoinformation Science department. So our department is very quantitative, so we do a lot of remote sensing. What is remote sensing? It's basically you have a sensor, which very often is a camera that is away from the place it takes pictures. So remote sensing, right? Now the sensor can be on an airplane, can be on a drone, or in our cases, can be on a satellite, right? So you have these high resolution cameras that are flying around the surface of the Earth and take pictures of different resolutions. And it used to be on film. So there were ginormous film negatives that were in crazy ways ejected by spy satellites and then caught by planes in nets and things like that. So the US Army, Air Force, and intelligence community over the last decades did really groundbreaking stuff when it came to taking pictures of places on Earth they were interested in. And now, more often than not, it is satellites from commercial providers that actually roam. Most notable one is Elon Musk. He's actually having not cameras flying around. He's having actually relays for network connections flying around. But there are similar providers that have their own satellite constellations flying around and taking pictures of any place on Earth multiple times a day. And you can get those images and you can look at them, or you can actually analyze them in a meaningful way to find out what's going on the ground, right? So the challenge more often than not is that you don't have, and that's why remote sensing and the imagery piece, quote unquote, is important, is you are not there. You're not on site. Yes, you do have local observers that tell you what's going on. And I think it was Reagan that said, trust but verify. So you really want to figure out, in order to figure out what's going on ground and what is happening in particular locations, you want to have many, many different sources that kind of corroborate the particular narrative of what's going on. And one such piece is satellite imagery. Now, there are many different ways, and Dr. Rothbard mentioned it before, is we use a lot of data sources, open source data. Open source data is any data sets that become publicly available and that are not collected by closed source means, so that are not collected by the government and not, but individuals, and they just publish them there. They curate them and they produce it. Like the Accolade data set that Matt mentioned before, that's an open source data set, right? Publicly available, and you can do your own analysis on top of it. Social media, news, media, those are also sources that will tell you what's going on. There are different kinds of databases from the United Nations, etc. They typically provide also very good background data sets about what is going on in a particular area over decades. So you get some benchmarks, some ground truth data sets that you can use to contrast your findings to. Eyewitness testimony is important, but that's again sketchy, right? How often do you really get eyewitness testimony about something that is going on and that you're interested in? You really have to be lucky, to be honest. And then there's remote sensing imagery. So you have your satellites flying around, and that, since you have the satellites up in the air quite, all the time, they're doing nothing else than flying around and taking pictures. So getting those imagery and trying to make some findings and make some deduction from those imagery and corroborate the other sources that you have is actually is kind of what, for this particular project, what we are doing. Now, I don't want to talk in an abstract way about methodology. I want to give you some examples. So this is, for the first time today, this is Sudan, right? So this is in Africa, this country, in the Sahel area, sub-Saharan Africa. So you have everything from a desert in the north to very rainforestry areas in the south. Of course, the Nile, an important river, flows right through Sudan. And in Khartoum, interestingly, the blue and the white Nile kind of come together before they head up north and eventually make it into Egypt and into the Mediterranean Sea. So Sudan is a very culturally rich country that unfortunately is really affected by extreme violence now since last year in April, but before that as well, right? So this country hasn't come to rest in quite some time, and people are extremely poor in a actually quite rich, culturally rich, but also in terms of resources, rich place. Now, Khartoum is here the capital is here on this side, at the intersection of the two, white and the blue Nile. And in what's really happening, or where a lot of destruction is happening, is here on the eastern side of Sudan, so it bordering Chad. So you have Al Fashir. So I'm going to talk specifically about Al Fashir, and that was even mentioned in the news quite a bit, and Al Janina. What's the situation in those places? Basically, you have the government forces called RSF that really hold cities, and you have so SAF, did I say RSF? SAF, the government forces are holding the cities, or they're holding the larger provincial capitals, and you have RSF, so this kind of militia forces from General Delgado, also called Hemeti, kind of encircling those places and kind of attacking those places. Al Fashir is one provincial capital that you have here in northern Darfur, and it has been contested for quite some time, and there's a lot of destruction going on. So if you look closer, so this is the city. You have a lot of buildings from as much as you can see from this map. You have refugee camps here up in the north. You have a refugee camp here also in the southwest that's not visible. You have also an airport that is held by the government forces. And what we try to figure out is, okay, what's going on there? What's going on in Al Fashir? What's kind of the damage? So how do we get started? So and you always look for indicators, right? You don't want to hit satellite imagery directly, but a very good indicator is NASA firms data. So NASA also has or is using a constellation of satellites that basically try to identify heat sources across the planet. That's typically used for wildfire, but you can also use it in terms of finding any kind of heat events, any kind of fires that might also be the result of destruction and might also be the result of conflict. So we use these data sets, and just by looking at this event data from this fire information, from these heat events from NASA, again, open source, you can identify location of something has happened there, right? So there was some thermal event that took place there. Now the sensor is not always that accurate, so you have to take it with a grain of salt, but it's a very good like initial guess. Then the next thing we throw into the mix is satellite imagery. So in this project, we have access to satellite imagery from different providers. The satellite imagery there, in terms of resolution, it goes down to 0.5 centimeter. So an image pixel has a correspondence of 0.5 meter on ground. So when you look at those imageries at the finest, really, you zoom in, quote unquote, you actually see quite a lot, right? And I will show you some examples afterwards. So you can use those imageries to verify damage and to basically figure out, okay, what really has happened on ground there. Now, overlaying this NASA FIRMS data with satellite imagery for Al-Fashir, what you can see already is you see some black stuff here. And this usually is like charring, so thermal events. So there was something was burning there, right? And especially down here where it's the purple dots on top of this area. So somebody did something to this area because in this black and white imagery, basically areas that are pretty much dead. So there's no vegetation. They're showing up as in black. So there's no, you can say it's the absence of light essentially in these places. That sort of triggers your interest. Now, you don't want to do it manually. So I'm just going here, Al-Fashir, it's not a huge place, right? So you could go through it and do it manually, and in part we did that. But you can also use some AI, some deep learning models that have been trained on image repairs. And what these deep learning models do is basically tell you, you have a before and an after image. It tells you whether there's a change there, right? So if you choose carefully what kind of satellite imagery you use, black and white imagery works pretty well. There is what's called also near infrared bands that more closely shows whether an area is alive, meaning there is plant life, etc., or where there is nothing, where it's burnt. So there are different bands from the satellites that you can get. So not everything is really RGB, so red, green, and blue values. So they're not really images that you're used to when you go on Google Maps, but you have different bands that all kind of detect and capture different parts of what is happening in this area. So you can feed those imageries that have multiple bands into those models, and then the models spit out something, what's here called this change mask. So it basically tells you that something is happening there, and those are the areas that are different. And it does so at the pixel level, and then you have to aggregate the pixel into larger areas, and then you can also overlay the changes with building data. We'll talk about that in a second. And then you can come up with kind of a potential impact map, right? Now, in this project, we basically used these deep learning models to come up with some candidate areas and candidate areas that were affected by, for example, in this case, destruction and thermal events, so fires. But then we also did some manual post-processing. So we used those candidate events, these candidate areas, and basically looked at and went over them and basically said, okay, is this really true? Kind of what the model found, because sometimes models are, you cannot trust them 100%, but they give you basically a 90% good result about what your final findings are going to look like. So it's basically we use a semi-automatic approach using a deep learning model to find potential changes, and then go over it manually and kind of assess it and post-process it. So what you came up with here is then these sort of areas, polygons that are affected or that indicate real, in this case, thermal events or fires that happen in Al-Fashir. Now, interestingly enough, you can do this over different timestamps, and then what you end up is kind of a change map. So you can come up with initial destruction in this case, which was red, going to orange, blue, and purple. So you saw that the conflict or this kind of fighting there in the area started here on this southeastern side and then moved further to the purple areas that are further in the south. So you see, and if you do this over a longer period of time, you can really see how the conflict in this particular area changes. And if you expand it to more cities, you can get really a fine-grained map about the evolution and the damages that are happening on ground in these areas. Now, interesting information that we also use in order to more quantify the damages, they're building maps. So it is actually not quite trivial to have a good data set that gives you a sense of the geometries, the polygons that delineate the individual buildings. So there are some public sites like Google did that on a global scale that gives you building outlines with also confidence value. So it tells you here on the right-hand side, everything that is green, the algorithm, they also use deep learning models, is pretty certain that those are buildings. But when you go down to red colors, then the algorithm is not as certain anymore. So you see here, this area in the middle, it's not quite clear what is a building. And if you go into more detail, a building in the United States is not comparable to a building in Sudan, especially when you look into more rural areas. Those buildings, they're just basically huts, right? So they're kind of very simple structures, very small structures that if you would look into OpenStreetMap data, or if you into the US, the people wouldn't live into such buildings, right? So this is totally different situation. And the algorithm, so in this case, Google's algorithm, has to deal with all these different settings, saying that I have to work in the US, I have to work in Europe, and I have to work in places like in Africa. But that being said, the result and the data set that Google provides you out of the box is actually pretty good. And one can use that really nicely to kind of quantify damage. So what happens is you just overlay building data with these affected areas, and then you can see how many structures were destroyed. If you look into more specialized building data, so if you want to find out what are hospitals, schools, etc., OpenStreetMap is your friend. So OpenStreetMap in many places, of course, there's no guarantee for completeness, is this data set not only of road networks, but also of building data sets that tells you what kind of outline and what kind of building it is, right? So we also used OpenStreetMap data to get more semantic information on certain buildings that we are specifically interested in. Now, it's a hit and miss with OpenStreetMap, of course, but it is a good resource that has global coverage. So in Al-Fashir, so this overlaying the damage information with building data resulted in, that should read 14,000 structures. So it's not 1,400 out of 400,000 total in Al-Fashir. So there's quite some damage that those buildings already represent. And of course, it's growing and growing and growing as the conflict goes more towards the city center. And so the government forces are getting more and more defeated. Now, if you want to go even more fine-grained, there's also population data. So there are different data sets out there that sort of estimate population on a grid level for the entire planet. Now, for Sudan, our experience was these data sets, and I just gave you a couple of links here. These data sets are not that accurate. So the population estimates were quite off, especially when you look at the resolution they are given. So take these data sets with a grain of salt. But again, the fact that they're out there, that gives you global population estimates, it's actually pretty amazing. And I just wanted to share these sources here as well. So this was Al Janina is another city that I want to talk briefly about. And just as an example, so I don't want to, Al-Fashir used more to explain the methodology. In Al Janina, I want to show you some concrete examples of some of the challenges that we have here. Al Janina is on the western side of Sudan. It's a border city to Chad. It was really affected in the beginning of the conflict, so there was a lot of destruction there. And one of our reports actually documents this destruction over time, over more than a year, that had happened in this community. So this is what the city looks like. The way it works, or the way it is organized, is you have the government forces. SAF is around the air base here in the northeast, and you have RSF, so this kind of militia forces that are here in the city center. And everything you see here is really destruction. So all the red areas here, buildings were really destroyed. And we used a similar methodology to kind of use different imageries from different times, from different dates, to kind of assess the damage over time. So if you look at an image here, that's a before image. That's from before April 2023. So you see here these buildings, and this is more or less the satellite resolution that we get. And you see buildings that are kind of intact. So you see roofs, and yeah, there are no single family homes, mansions that we are used to here in Northern Virginia. Those are really tiny buildings that are maybe 5 by 5 meters, aka yards, right? So the buildings are not too big. You have some metal roofs. So depending on kind of what's the material for the roof, you get different kinds of reflections, and that in itself is actually interesting. But that's for another time. Now, what happened? Conflict came through this area, and this is what happened, right? Same area. This is what the buildings nowadays look like. Basically, they're just empty shells, right? So there are no roofs. Buildings have hardly any roof. Population has left. Yeah, the area is basically a wasteland, is now part of these quote unquote red areas that you saw in the previous slide. So there's a lot of destructions. And if you look at El Janina specifically, there are many areas that look like that. And there are also many, there used to be refugee camps run by the United Nations. All these camps kind of were raided by the militia forces and were basically destroyed. So they all disappeared. So Al Janina now is really a much smaller area, with much of it really being destroyed throughout the conflict. So this is a visual result of what you saw before. So that's also part of the report that came out. So you see this whole area and the large parts that really got destroyed in this conflict. Now, what happens with all this information? Well, this information feeds into reports that we publish, and you can access it. So I don't think this report is out yet, but if you go to the Conflict Observatory webpage, and there are these PDF documents that have a lot of this information there and describe the findings. And there's a narrative combining observer information from social media, from open source information, and linking it back to satellite imagery and to destructions to come up with these comprehensive narratives about certain either certain cities, certain events that have happened over the years, over the months and years, 2 years now, and give you some more in-depth information. And what's also nice at the end of the report, all the sources that were used in this report are actually mentioned. So you can actually go and you can actually read up in more depth about what is happening there. And this is kind of, hopefully this brings kind of the four of us and what we have been talking about to kind of try to bring it full circle. So this is what we have been doing, and this is what we continue to do in this effort. It is really, it's very challenging work, very interesting work, and yeah, and I personally learned a lot about by kind of doing this hands-on research, and yeah, it's and there are many thoughts around this conflict, but again, that's for another time.
Thanks very much, Dieter. It is absolutely challenging, exciting, frustrating. But one of the exciting aspects of the project, at least for me, is learning the methodologies from your department and others, the methodologies that Matt Berry is using, and also working with the many experts at MITRE, David's colleagues at MITRE David is working with us, and his colleagues are deeply involved in the data gathering and analysis. And I should say, a point that Matt said, one of the frustrating aspects, of course, it's important to find the data, but we know that there's so many incidents of civilian devastation that it's just hard to document. It's very difficult to document, but all of which is necessary for potential human rights violations. The reports, I just put in the chat the link to our reports in the Sudan Observatory platform. So please look at these reports for more information. We're presently working on additional reports which will be posted soon. So we have some time for questions, comments, observations, anything. So feel free to raise your hand or just put your question in the chat. And let me just emphasize how absolutely exciting it is to work with everybody on this team. We all came together for this project, and it's an example. We all know that the Carter School is interdisciplinary, but I think this is the first time the Carter School has worked with your department, Dieter, at such depth, the Department of
Yeah, I think that's true.
Geography and Geoinformation Science. So this is really exciting. So
Dan, I see some hands going up. So
yeah, Fernando.
you want to take them?
Yeah, I'll take them. Fernando.
Okay, thank you very much. That was super informative. Thank you for the presentation. I have a question specifically for Matt, and it relates to when you're gathering the data about who were the performers of the attacks. How can you identify that it was Force A as compared to Force B? That was one of the huge difficulties I had in doing similar work. So I would like to know how is it possible to identify who the attacker is? Thank you.
Okay. Well, we use not only the information provided by the data sources, and we triangulate by looking at alternative sources. For example, information provided by one newspaper is checked against information provided by another. And we also look at pictures, for example, that are provided in the social media. Some attacks have been claimed, for example, by the RSF, for example, against the government, the Sudan Armed Forces. We look also at the areas controlled by the different parties. We know, for example, that the RSF have been controlling parts of Sudan, especially on Durman area, Bari, and so on. And when there is fighting there, and a site controlled by the RSF is affected by, let's say, aerial bombing, even if the government side, the Sudan armed forces are not clearly named, we know that it is likely to be the Sudanese armed forces. But out of precaution for the perpetrators, will just write fighting between the RSF and the Sudan armed forces.
So it boils down to a likely.
Yeah,
it's not like certainly.
We rely mostly on the information provided by the sources. That's why we always say presume perpetrators, because you know, in a war setting, sometimes it's difficult to know who is doing what. And when you look at the results of the statistical analysis, you will see that there are at least, let me go to the slide. There are at least more than 50 incidents for which we could not determine the perpetrator. And we just write unknown, unknown. Don't know who is the perpetrator. It is likely to be either the RSF or the Sudan Armed Forces or another armed group.
Yeah. Fernando, sometimes the data just comes, we look at testimony of witnesses, and sometimes they're vague. They'll say, I think it was RSF. So what do we do with that?
Mm.
Or sometimes, they wore uniforms that were similar to. That is a piece of data which is clearly inadequate. So we often need to make a judgment call based on conservatism before we identify.
The thing with this is that this also relates with accountability, no? Like if you're gonna have claims of like this is genocide,
Exactly.
then who committed the genocide?
Exactly.
So you need to know who the person was.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
big challenge, but wonderful work. Thank you.
Thank you. Leah Tudor.
Hello. My
Hello.
question has to do with the satellite satellite imagery, and I was just curious if there were any sort of like legal implications and like how using satellite imagery, like how if there are any issues with like sovereignty and international law when using that, and then in addition to like legal implications, are there any sort of like ethical implications that have to do with using satellite imagery? Thank you.
Is this to Dieter Fosher?
Yeah. I mean,
Okay.
I guess to the legal implications, Dave can say more about that. But so the satellite images, I mean, you have to see like that. So you have companies that basically build constellations and they fly around 300 kilometers above Earth and take pictures of the Earth. Period. Right. So there's nothing you can do it against it. In our case, we basically, through a subscription, we are getting this imagery. So we get access to this in a programmatic way. The resolution we get is at the level where you see enough, but not too much. So I'm sure there's other imagery that is more high resolution. And if you use, I guess the more legal or issues you might have is if you have a drone that is flying over your territory, all right? Then yeah, you might have some issues there. But yeah, I mean, there is no, at least at the resolution we are using the imagery. You don't see too much, but it's good enough for us to assess damage. I mean, this is the whole goal that we had there.
Yeah. Dave, do you want to add to that?
Sure. No, that's a great question, Leah. And this has been, for me, one of the more interesting parts of the project, the commercial vendor space that exists out there, and it's very much the Wild West in some ways in terms of regulation, like you said, ethical issues, all of that. But in terms of report production, as long as the imagery that is acquired through the Conflict Observatory is properly copyrighted and marked appropriately, it can be shared with anyone. All very, very interesting. And I kind of date myself a little bit. I'm a former intelligence officer. And the stuff we were looking at back then is very similar to what commercial satellites have access to now. So yeah, no, that's a great question.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Richard Morris.
Great, thank you. Great presentation. A quick question. Regarding data mining, what has been the most surprising and unanticipated insights you've been able to collect?
I saw you. That's a really interesting question.
Yeah.
Richard, I saw that in the chat. I'm going to go around. What, Matt?
So
Yeah, well,
go ahead, Matt.
sometimes when you go through the data, you find really surprising trends. For example, that some type of violence happens in RSF control areas or in government control areas, and that it is the group that control the area that is accused, or that the government side, let's say, well, some people say there is no more legitimate government in Sudan. The Sudanese army is itself responsible for human rights abuses and deliberate attacks against non-combatant civilians. And yet it is bound by the obligations of international humanitarian law. And it is party to several human rights treaties. That this government part, well, this army that claims now to be the government is not making, for example, an effort to enforce and implement international humanitarian law obligations. So this is quite surprising. And when the UN fact-finding mission came up with a report and pointed that out, that the government side or the Sudanese army has itself committed human rights abuses on a very large scale, the report was rejected by the Sudan Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They considered it as, quite flimsy and not relying on solid methodologies and so on. But even without going to Sudan, from our online data searching, we were able to highlight this fact that the government side has also been responsible for abuses. And repeatedly, whether it is in areas that they control or not, they have targeted civilians, especially through aerial bombardment. And we have data that show it. And the satellite imagery also show it.
Yeah. Okay, Dieter and Dave, do you want to address that?
Yeah, briefly. I mean, it's right now we are not sure on conflicts around the world, right? And conflicts are fought in different ways and with different weapons. I just want to say about Sudan, it's kind of, I don't know, shocking, horrifying. I'm not sure how to put it, but the fighting parties in Sudan do not have heavy weapons, right? They do not have cruise missiles. They don't have airplanes that can, with sophisticated bombs. They have drones and small caliber weapons and RPGs and they're throwing barrel bombs off airplanes, off helicopters, right? So it's basically a barrel full of kerosene that they ignite. So it's like a big Molotov cocktail. So this is kind of all they have. That being said, the amount of destruction they can inflict onto each other is mind-blowing, right? So what the lack of sophisticated weaponry, but still this determination to destroy things that exists in this country can still lead to this vast destruction of and loss of human life and destruction of a country that is basically breaking apart. It's mind-blowing about how little sophistication you need in terms of weaponry to wreak havoc. This is crazy. Compare this with what's going on in Gaza, compare this to what's going on in Ukraine. It's, I don't know. I was shocked and surprised at the same time by what you see there.
Dave, do you want to address that question?
That's a good point, Dieter. Yeah, Dan, I guess from my perspective, this kind of speaks to how groundbreaking this work really is, because if you look at the so-called on-the-ground data or information that's captured in ACLID or publicly available in other databases, it's often very ambiguous, dirty, unclear, kind of to your point, Fernando, about difficult discerning the perpetrators. But fused with overhead satellite imagery, pictures don't lie. So that methodology, to me, is pretty innovative and groundbreaking in trying to tell the story of the destruction going on in Sudan.
Right. And I'll just say very briefly, I see there's other hands up. I'm always intrigued, bewildered, stunned by the mindset of perpetrators. I mean, that's kind of, we have a lab called Transforming the Mind for Peace. I just can't figure out why would there be strategic, systematic targeting of hospitals on a massive scale. And the targeting involves brutalizing the medical staff and attacking the patients and so on. And some of it is just, it's in the way or whatever, but it is definitely strategic, at least on the part of RSF. SAF has also attacked hospitals. So what is in the mindset? I think that's a huge mystery to some degree. And we really need to investigate that much more, especially about the history. Okay, moving on. Randy.
So I was wondering, along the lines of previous questions, is there some sort of international evidentiary standard that has developed and continues to develop over time as methods improve and change? Among the ICC and just the international community, is there a standard that you are trying to hit when you are doing your research?
Well, okay, I'll say briefly, and others can add or correct what I'm saying. We were given certain instructions by the sponsor, which is the United States Department of State, in conjunction with MITRE, for criteria. The ideal standards are set by what's called the Berkeley Protocol. I don't recall the full name for that, Dave. Maybe you can correct me. And those standards are extremely rigorous. And we are trying to meet those standards. There's no question we're contributing evidence. We have provided evidence to support accusations of human rights violations. There's no question about that. But this would need to be in conjunction with other evidence if this went to actually an ICC prosecution. Dave, you want to address that question?
Yeah, I dropped a link in the chat. The Berkeley Protocol really is the kind of go-to document of reference for OSINT investigations to meet some sort of evidentiary standard that would hold up in international criminal court. Again, this is all very groundbreaking, so kind of setting precedent as we go. But normally for these investigations, the Berkeley Protocol is the standard.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Dave. And Deborah, you have the last question for this session. So
Okay. I'll make it quick, and you might have already addressed it, but seeing the report with women not mentioning or not having high numbers didn't surprise me because women aren't big reporters in general with crime. So with the protests and the did you purposefully, as Matt was saying, leave that out because you wanted it separated with?
I'm not sure. I don't understand your question.
He said in the beginning that the protests were not counted in your.
Oh, that's right. Okay,
Yes,
sorry.
yes,
That was like
Yeah.
a big thing that it was
Yeah.
not counted.
I
So I'm just curious. Go ahead.
Okay, since we started our data collection in February, we don't have data for the rest of the period.
2019.
War started, let's say 2023, April 2023 up to February 2024. We don't have that data. So to check whether the trends that emerged from our data were the same that emerged from the ACLED data, I had to retrieve relevant data from ACLED, and I couldn't just take all data for incidents recorded in Sudan. This is thousands of incidents. So I filtered the data and only focus on incidents that are related to the war and that are mostly related to human rights abuses and to battles or attacks on civilians.
Okay.
When
Yeah,
you look at the ACLED data, you realize that since the war started, in fact, you didn't have many protests and
Right there.
and riots. Most of the incidents recorded are incidents related to the war.
Yeah, so that was our mandate. What Matt is referring to is our instructions and our mandate. So thank you very much, Deborah. All right, we're all going to move on. As you could tell, this is enormously complicated. It's rewarding to find data. It's disgusting to come across the content of the data, especially in my opinion with verbatim testimony that is really in many cases horrific to see. But all the data is obviously reflects horrors. And yet it's also frustrating, as I mentioned, that we know there's so many crimes being committed that we can't get very compelling data on this. It's very challenging. So we're going to just keep moving forward. And all of this illustrates, just for, I see there's my students in this space, the blending of conflict analysis with conflict, as it were, resolutions, with justice seeking, with redressing injustice. These two, it's not separate. Analysis and justice seeking, in this case, bringing perpetrators to justice, is an inseparable challenge which underpins our project. So thank you all for joining. I hope you found this rewarding and valuable. And I would like to ask the other speakers, send me your PowerPoint, and I'm going to send them to my students, at least, or anyone else, obviously, who asks me. So thank you very much. So
Thanks all.
Thank you.
I'll stay on if there's any question. And thank you, Matt and Dave. Thank you so much for this. I think this went really well.
Thank you, everyone. Amazing, amazing. Thank you. Have a good night.
Okay, thanks, Emma. Okay, that was fantastic presentation. Dave, thanks so much for the outline, the summary of MITRE. That was terrific. And Matt, the data you have is really great. I haven't seen some of those. The way you put it, you organized it so well.
Yeah,
I really like that.
I added the data on the perpetrators. I was a bit hesitant to add the data on the perpetrators, but at the end I said, okay, you have also other data sets.
Wait, I'm going to
that provide information on the presumed perpetrator, so we can also include that in our analysis. But this is the most difficult part of the analysis, because you should never assume that what the sources say are the perpetrators.
Right, exactly. So
but we have other sources backing us. The UN fact-finding mission arrived to almost the same conclusion.
Yeah.
Data go in the same direction. So I felt it's safe to include that slide on the perpetrators.
Very good. Oh yeah, absolutely. There's so much of what we do that's a judgment call. Whether we say this is true, or as you pointed out, Matt, there's evidence to suggest such and so. There's so many words that deal with epistemic kind of waffling, or but that happens a lot. All right, this is great. Thank you very much.
Yep. Thanks, guys. That was fun.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you.
All right. I'll talk to you soon.
See you.